Welcome to Heavy Storytelling. How are you doing today? We are going to be reading a story. But first up, we are going to be doing the joke of the day. Then we are going to be doing the Bible. Then we are going to be reading the mystery book. That you guys don't know what it is yet, but I do, and I'm really excited for this one. I haven't ever read it before, but
You haven't?
No.
We read it in Oklahoma. You probably don't remember.
Yeah, I probably don't remember, but I'm really excited for this one. So I hope you guys enjoy this video. Alonzi.
I don't know if they heard Alan Z. Is there anybody there?
One person.
Just me.
One person. Hi, here's Daniel! Yay!
I haven't done this in a while, so forgive me if I'm a little rusty. Okay, first of all, hi. I'm gonna be doing the joke of the day. Why can't a bicycle stand?
I don't know.
Because it's too tired.
It's too tired.
I
get it.
Oh, two, as in two of them.
Too tired. Okay, we have two people here. That wasn't intended. Hi, Rebecca! Rebecca says hi, Daniel. So, we are reading... Da, 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 da. I'm kind of waiting for Granny Bear to be here.
Oh, wait, can't watch tonight. I'll watch the video later.
No.
Granny Bear.
Oh.
She's always here now.
That makes me sad. Okay, well, I want to tell the story because we were hoping to read this book in the fall. Actually, it was the book that we were looking forward to. Who is there? There's a new person there that I don't recognize. Say hi, and we will say hi back to you. So the story is that we were trying to read this in the fall, probably about the time that we were reading the Mara book, or maybe it was right after the Mara book was the intended. Hi, Jessica! So happy to see you. We're reading a new book. This is a good time to start listening. Okay, so we were going to read this in the fall, and I'm pretty sure I thought that I pulled it out. Kimberly and I were looking through books, and I thought that I had pulled it out and set it aside as this is a book for the live stream, and then we couldn't find it after that, and I don't know what happened to it. Woohoo, I'm excited. Thank you. I'm so excited that you're excited. Hi, Granny Bear. So then we couldn't find it, and we couldn't find it, and we couldn't find it, and I think I said something probably too many times in the live stream. And so for a Christmas present, one of our faithful viewers sent it to me. So now I have another copy of it, and I'm so glad that we have Twice Freed. And there's another story about this because one time we watched this, or we read this book, and Ben was listening. I think this is the second or third time that I've read this to the kids now. So Ben was listening, and he looked at the cover, and he said, after we read the first chapter, he said that the boy likes the girl, and that they end up together at the end. Just from reading the first chapter and looking at the cover, he deduced all of that on his own, and that was probably about 5 years ago. So, we'll have to find out. Now, I do want to say one rule about the reading of this book. Yes, it is a Bible story. Yes, my older kids probably all remember the story. I would really like it if nobody goes to the Bible and looks up all the stories before we read them in this. Okay, so this tells it really well, and we can read the Bible stories afterwards if you want to, but I don't want people to jump into spoilers. You can read it on your own if you want to, but the spoilers, let's keep that to a minimum. All right, so that's the one rule that I'm going to impose on this book. But I love this book. It's one of my favorites. It's by Patricia St. It's called Twice Freed. And with all of that, we're going to go to the Bible. So, we just finished the prophetic Psalm 22, and now we are going to read Psalm 23. And I'm just going to read that one psalm, even though it's really short today, and that's what we're going to do. So this is the English Standard Version, Psalm 23, a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That is Psalm 23, the English Standard Version of the Bible, and we will continue on with the book of Psalms. No kibitzing. Yes, I guess that was what all of that stuff was about. No kibitzing. All right. So there is a foreword written by Patricia St. John's sister Hazel, which I'm going to save for the end because it kind of gives some spoilers. So in the practice of not giving spoilers, I'm not going to read the spoilers that are given to us in the foreword. It does say, dedicated to my sister Hazel, who produced a Volkswagen and a tent and accompanied me in the steps of St. Paul. They actually drove around Turkey together, she and her sister, when or before she was writing the book. So it's kind of cool. And the author passed away in 1993, and now I'm going to begin. Chapter 1. Twice Freed, Chapter 1. It was mid-afternoon in early July, and the parched world was, in general, asleep. The black flocks for which the valley was famous huddled under the poplar trees, and the reapers drowsed in the shade of their stooks of corn or under their wooden carts. In the well-to-do houses set high above the pasture land, prosperous landowners and farmers and wool merchants slept soundly on their couches, while their slaves dozed guiltily, with one ear cocked under the vines in the courtyard. Even the vultures hung motionless as though stuck flat against the blue. Only up in the gorge, where the air seemed to swim over the burning rocks, something moved. A brown-skinned boy of 12, naked except for a loincloth and sandals, was climbing the canyon with the grace and agility of a young wild cat. He cared nothing for the sweat that was steaming down his face, or for the rocks that blistered his hands, for this was his hour of freedom. From early dawn till late at night he belonged to his master and outwardly bowed to his discipline, but at this hour he belonged to himself, and lived and conquered and exulted. Here in the canyons nothing could withstand him. In winter he cut paths through the snowdrifts, and in spring he breasted the cascades and the waterfalls. In summer the fierce afternoon heat could not daunt him, and he climbed on with one eye on the sun which was now to the west of him. When the shadow of the rock above him reached the border of the olive grove below, he knew he must turn home, but he still had time to reach the old fallen pine that blocked the ravine, and to dive into the green pool that lay on the further side of it. The gorge was narrowing now, and the pines and stunted oaks and junipers cast their shade across the ravine. The stream was no more than a trickle, but it was cool and sweet, and he dashed the water over his face and body and felt he could go on climbing all day. He always yearned to go further up to the bitter salt lake Anava, where the absinthe flowers grew and where the river Lycus was born, up to the snows of Mount Cadmus, but the shade was creeping toward the olive grove, and his master would be stirring in his sleep. He cursed and spat. At least he would have time for a quick swim in the green pool that was so deep that it never dried up. He scrambled up onto the fallen tree, and then stopped dead, his mouth open and his eyes dilated with a strange, superstitious fear, for a little girl was sitting on the trunk, dangling her legs over the water, singing softly to herself. She was about 9 or 10 years old, small and slender, with smooth dark hair hanging to her waist. Her cheeks were flushed with heat, and her lap was full of the flowers she had been gathering, drooping scabious and buttercups and forget-me-nots from the stream's edge. So absorbed was she that she did not see the boy approaching. Who was she? Her simple tunic was of rich material. Her sandals were new and expensive. Her bearing, even as she played, was that of a little queen. He watched her intently, crouching on the trunk, for he was still not sure of her identity. Was she some daughter of Cybele, the great mother of nature, to whose arms the dead returned like homing children? Well, if she was, there was nothing to fear, for she was certainly no demon. He drew a little nearer, and a twig snapped under his feet. She looked up and gave a start, but she showed no great surprise or fear, for she was a practical child, and to her a boy was a boy. Besides, he looked a nice boy, and she was just beginning to feel slightly afraid of what she had done. "What are you doing up here, boy?" she asked in perfect Greek. "I thought everyone was asleep." "What are you doing?" he retorted rather severely, for he was convinced now that she was nothing but a human girl. It is a long way up the canyon for a little maid to stray alone, and anyway, who are you?" "I'm Irene," replied the child. She spoke guardedly and watched him gravely, as though wondering how much it was safe to reveal. And he gazed back at her, the tremulous sunlight falling upon her through the pine boughs, so alone and defenseless among the crags of the ravine, and he found himself longing to know all about her, to gain her trust, and, if need be, to protect her. "But where is your home, Irene? I've never seen you playing with the little girls of Colossae." "I live in Laodicea," she replied, still watchful, still hesitant. "Laodicea?" he repeated in astonishment, for Laodicea was 10 miles across the valley. "Surely you never came here alone, and will no one be looking out for you?" "Yes, they will." Her eyes suddenly twinkled with amusement, and her confidences came pouring out. "They will be getting crazy about me. I came over this morning with my father. He makes cloaks, and he came to talk to Master Philemon about wool. But they went in to dine together, and I was left with my nurse and the slaves. My nurse started to talk to Philemon's slaves, and she didn't want me to hear. She gave me some food and told me to go out into the vineyard, but there was nothing to do in the vineyard. I wanted to climb and see what lay at the top of the canyon, so I ran away. I climbed right up here, and I should have gone further, but the green pool stopped me." "But weren't you afraid, so high up, all alone?" "No," replied Irene with spirit. "I like being alone. I get sick of my nurse. She is so afraid of my father, she never takes her eyes off me at home. It is Irene this, Irene that, till I could scream. Why should I do what she wants and go where she takes me all day long? Don't you ever want to get away from everybody and do what you like instead of doing what you're told all the time?" The boy laughed aloud. He was indeed a kindred spirit. "Yes," he replied, "indeed I do. That is why I come up the ravine, to get away from everyone and do what I like. Sometimes when I have time, I swim across the pools and go higher up into the rocks, up to where the eagles live. One day I shall go even further. One day I shall follow the river right to its source. One day I shall climb right to the top of the peak and look over the whole land of Phrygia and away to the sea westward, and then one day I shall cross that sea. They say the land of Greece is the most beautiful in the world." He stopped, surprised at his own outburst, for he usually kept his longing to himself. His thoughts came back abruptly to the little creature at his side who sat staring up at him, eyes alight, sharing his visions. "You ought to go home," he said. "Your nurse will be out of her mind. And what about your mother? Did you leave her in Laodicea?" A shadow passed over the child's face. "She died 2 years ago," she said simply. "When she was alive, it was different. She never watched me all the time. She let me play, pick flowers, and go where I liked. When she was alive, I was free." "Have you no brothers or sisters to play with?" "No, there's only me. My father says I am all he has and very precious to him, so my nurse never dares to stop looking after me. My father's a very busy man, always down at the looms or going to look at wools or traveling down to Ephesus or Miletus with the merchandise. Sometimes I think he forgets all about me." "I don't suppose he does, really," said the boy comfortingly. "Come, Irene, we must go home now at once. Swing over the bow like that, and you will reach the rock with the tips of your toes. Now, down to the next one, and into the stream bed. It's easier there. Loop your dress into your girdle, and take my hand. Now, just jump from rock to rock as I do, and we'll soon be down." He glanced anxiously at the shadows below him. Already half the olive grove was immersed in shade. He was very late, and his master Philemon had an important guest, and would have been yelling for him for the past hour. He had not known what had been happening in his master's house, as he had been sent out early with a message to the shepherds in the distant pasture up the valley, and he had not been expected back until after Philemon's siesta. Perhaps he could invent some story about difficulty in finding the flocks. That might at least delay his beating until his master could investigate. In any case, it did not matter too much. He was used to beatings. What mattered now was the nimble little creature who held his hand so tightly and laughed so gaily she missed her footing, skipping from one side of the stream bed to the other. He must hand her over safe and sound to the nurse and say goodbye. She was the only daughter of a rich Laodicean merchant, and he a poor slave at Colossae. Why should his mind refuse so doggedly to say goodbye? They were nearly out of the canyon now, and he reached up to help her down from a boulder too high for her. But before he could take hold of her, he was startled by a piercing scream behind him, and turning his head quickly, he received a stinging slap in the face, then another and another from a strong young slave, while the nurse screamed hysterically and held out her arms to the child. "Oh, Mistress Irene, you cruel girl," shrieked the nurse. "How could you disobey me and run off with this wicked, wicked boy? Oh, Mistress Irene, I've been nearly out of my mind, hunting through the vineyards where I told you to stay. How could you listen to a low slave and run away from your own poor nurse? Oh, beat him again, Meander. Beat the breath out of him." Meander, holding the boy fast, noticed that he neither struggled nor made any attempt to escape. He lifted his hand to strike him again, but was arrested by a sudden shriek of rage above him. Irene stood poised on the boulder like a small commanding fury, her eyes blazing, trembling with anger. "Let him go this instant, Meander," she shouted. "Do as I tell you immediately, or I'll tell my father of you. How dare you hit that good boy?" She suddenly ceased to be a commanding fury, and burst into tears, a frightened, hurt little girl whose happy afternoon had been spoilt. Kicking her nurse aside, she slid off the boulder all by herself and took her stand defiantly beside the boy. Meander had to let go. He had a healthy fear of his little mistress' temper. "Does my father know I'm lost yet?" asked Irene, sniffling hard. The tears were still running down her cheeks, but she had drawn herself up to her full small height and held her head high. "No, Mistress Irene," twittered the nurse. "He is still talking business, but he will call for you at any moment now. I pray you come back quickly." "I shall not come back if you say any bad things about this boy," retorted Irene. "I shall stay here and be lost, and my father will be very, very angry with you both for losing me. He will probably punish you both when I tell him." It was only too likely. The nurse started to plead tearfully. Meander scratched his head. The boy looked her straight in the face. "Come home, Irene," he said gently. "I must go to my work now, but if I see your father, I will tell him you are all coming." He took her hand and helped her over the last rough bit of rock. Meander controlled himself with difficulty. "Mistress," protested the frantic nurse, "a common slave." "I don't care what he is," retorted Irene. "He's a boy, and he helped me. Goodbye, boy, and thank you. One day we will meet again." "The gods forbid," muttered Meander under his breath, but the boy took no notice. He turned back and looked straight at Irene and spoke to her alone, as though ratifying a covenant. "Yes," he said, One day we shall meet again. Chapter 2. He sped down the steep olive slopes and arrived breathless at his master's house. He had not wanted Irene to know he was Philemon's slave, but, of course, it had all come out in the end. It always did, he thought suddenly. There was no escaping the fact of his slavery, and yet it had not really mattered. It warmed his heart that, knowing all, she had still stood by him and still wanted to see him again. The thought of that had made him forget his stinging, bruised cheeks. In fact, he only remembered them as he flung himself breathlessly into his master's house and confronted young Archippus, Philemon's son. "You're late, Onesimus," said Archippus sharply. "My father has been calling for you. He has a guest, and he wanted you to bring the wine when they finish the siesta. He is very disappointed with you. Where have you been, and who slapped you in the face?" "I've been down at the sheep pastures," said Onesimus hopefully. "It took a long time to find those shepherds. They had gone down to the river to water the flocks." "Liar," said Archippus scornfully. "You were back from the pastures soon after noon. One of the slaves saw you running up to those precious ravines of yours several hours ago, and my father knows it, so don't try out this story on him." It was only 2 or 3 years ago that Onesimus and Archippus had climbed the canyons together, and although Archippus, since leaving school, was busy establishing the new relationship of master and slave, and Onesimus was one busy resenting it, there was still a close bond between them. Archippus, as a baby, had spent hours in the slave's hut, watching the grindstone, blowing in the charcoal, snuggling down into the unteaseled piles of black sheep's wool that awaited the spinning wheel. The two had explored the stream beds together, dammed the same pools, shared the secrets about birds' nests and foxes' lairs, and together tracked bears and hyenas. Onesimus hated Archippus and was ashamed of it, because Archippus had been his good friend in the past. Archippus loved Onesimus, and was also ashamed of it. It was weak and unmanly to love a slave. "Who is the guest?" asked Onesimus, hastily wiping the mud off his hands and arms and slipping on a clean tunic. "Philemon from Laodicea," replied Archippus impressively. "He's the richest cloak-maker in the town, and he has decided to buy our wool. He came over this morning to see some of our flocks and to take back some samples. He may even introduce our wool to others of his guild. It may mean a journey to Ephesus later on, and I shall go too." Onesimus, fastening his girdle, made no reply. Somewhat fearfully, he entered the atrium or central court of the house and stood before his master. Archippus, anxious to see what would happen, slipped in behind him and sat down at his father's feet. Philemon and his guest reclined on couches, sipping their wine and talking eagerly. It was a beautiful courtyard, shaded by an old vine, which dangled its ripe bunches of grapes through the lattice work that supported it. The floor was paved in the Greek style with colored mosaic, and a fountain played in the center. Philemon, a prosperous farmer with a keen, weather-bronzed face, turned sharply on the young truant. His guest was an important one, and though he had plenty of slaves on call, he would have liked to have had this graceful boy in attendance. "Why are you late?" he asked coldly. It suddenly struck Onesimus that it might pay to tell the truth, or at least some of it. It might also afford an excellent opportunity of revenging himself on the slave Meander. He turned and bowed to the guest. "I beg you to excuse me, sir," he said. "You have a little daughter?" Philemon frowned, and the guest raised his eyebrows, as much as to say, "If I have, what is that to you?" "She strayed too far at her play, sir," went on Onesimus, undiscouraged. "I saw her climbing the rocks up in the ravines, and went after her. She was little, sir, and the boulders were high. I brought her down slowly, helping her where the ground was rough." "And the name of the goddess?" exclaimed Philemon, the cloak-master, half rising. "Where was her nurse, and where is Irene now?" "I restored her to her nurse, master," replied Onesimus. "In fact, I met the nurse and the slave Meander at the entrance to the vineyard searching for her. No harm has come to the little maid. If you would have me bring her, I will go myself," said Archippus, rising hastily, "and see that all is well." His handsome young face was flushed with jealousy and arrogance. That impudent young Onesimus should have been keeping company with Polemon's daughter and championing her in danger was indeed a twist of fortune. He left the room hastily, and Polemon carelessly threw a piece of gold at Onesimus. "Take that for your services," he said. "The nurse shall be dismissed tonight, and the slave punished. She's a willful little maid, and needs a mother. Now to go back to those bales of wool we were discussing just now." His daughter was forgotten, and he was once again intent on his money-making, his eyes gimlet-shrewd. Onesimus stood quietly at attention for a time, pouring out wine when necessary, and then Philemon sent him to fetch fruit, and he left the room on silent, bare feet. But as he crossed the outer courtyard on his way to the kitchen, he stopped and caught his breath. Irene was sitting in front of the house, framed in the vine leaves that clustered round the door. She was playing with a late-born black lamb that Archippus had brought her, and he sat beside her, both of them laughing at the tame, nuzzling little creature. Her nurse was on guard a short distance away. As Onesimus came toward them, Irene looked up and called to him joyously. He took a step towards her, smiling, but Archippus rose immediately. Back to your work, slave," he ordered, and Onesimus had no choice but to obey his master's son. Ashamed to look again at the happy, innocent little face, he hurried on his errand, and it was not till he was standing again behind his master that he realized that something had happened to him. In those few moments he had changed. Firstly, all his allegiance to the memory of their childhood together had died, and he now hated Archippus with a steady, purposeful hatred. Secondly, he had made up his mind to be free. At whatever cost, and whatever he had to do to achieve it, he would be free. He fingered his small gold piece knotted in his girdle, and it seemed like a pledge. "I will keep it till I purchase my freedom," he said to himself. "It is the beginning." "Slave!" Philemon spoke sharply and clapped his hands. "I have spoken, and you take no heed. Fetch Master Polemon's cloak, and give word to the slaves to prepare his litter." The slaves were already waiting, glancing anxiously at the westering sun, for they had 10 miles to go, and the valley abounded in thieves and robbers lying in wait for rich travelers after sunset. Onesimus helped Polemon into his cloak, and put on his sandals, and then withdrew to watch the departure from behind the lintel of the stables. He saw Archippus lift the little girl into the seat beside her father, and hand her a vine leaf of mulberries, and he noticed that she thanked him gravely and politely, but with eyes averted, nor did she say, "We shall meet again." As the 4 slaves set off at a run with the gorgeous little litter borne on their shoulders, he saw her lean out and take a long look back, but she was not looking for Archippus. He wondered why, for Archippus was strong and handsome, 2 years older than himself and half a head taller. By the time he had cleared up the remains of the midday banquet and laid out the evening meal and mixed the wine with honey, it was nearing sunset. Another slave would wait on the family while they ate, and he was free to go home. As he rose at cockcrow, he was usually ready to swallow his food and fall asleep, but tonight he was in no hurry, and sleep seemed far from him. He sat in the doorway long after he finished his supper of lentils, looking out to where the sun had now dipped behind the mountains northwest of the valley, and the colors still flamed in the sky. On the upper plain of Colossae, the harvest was nearly ended, and the slow wooden wagons, drawn by oxen, were rumbling up the dusty paths between the poplars, the tired reapers resting on the piled-up wheat. Behind them, across the valley, he could see the white limestone cliffs and cascades of Hierapolis, and below them, on the grassy hill above the river, the roofs and columns of Laodicea. Perhaps she would have arrived by now. All the little sounds of twilight, the croaking of the frogs in the marsh, the the whir of the crickets, the rattling cry of the stork making for her nest, the bleating of the folded sheep seemed clearer and more important than ever before. He stared with rapt attention at the curling tendrils of the vine leaf, the crimson folded petals of the pomegranate flowers within reach of his hand, and he knew again he had changed. "Mother," he said suddenly, "tell me about my father." His mother laughed and sat down beside her moody, restless son, her hands busy with the studded teasing card, her heart with him all the time. She was a beautiful, dark-eyed Phrygian woman, born into slavery, content with a master who was as kind as masters went. She had loved her husband dearly, but she was glad that death had set him free, for to him slavery was a bondage too heavy to be borne. "I think you know all there is to be known," she said. "What ails you tonight?" He shook his head. "Nothing," he replied. "Only I should like to hear again about my father." "He was born on the slopes of Mount Parnassus in Greece," began his mother, "and he loved all beautiful things. When he grew up, he became a scholar in Athens. He said it was the most beautiful city in the world, and often he would sit of an evening and talk to me about his country. He would go on and on about islands set like jewels in a blue sea, about mountains whose heads were veiled in clouds where the gods lived, and about the great marble Acropolis standing on a hill above the city. He married me because I was beautiful, and he loved me. But he was never happy here in a strange land and among strange gods. Those born free cannot submit to slavery. It was well that he returned to Cybele and her fair meadows." She fell silent, gazing out into the dusk. "Go on," said Onesimus. "Tell me about the brigands." "Your father was a traveler, always restless, always wanting to see over the top of the mountain," said his mother with a tender smile. "He lectured for years in a school in Athens, and then set off one early spring morning to visit the University of Tarsus, and to study the teaching of one Athenodorus. He often talked about that journey. He joined a caravan in early summer when the snows were melting on the Taurus mountains. How he loved the gazelles on the Sicilian plains. At the end of the summer he traveled on while the roads into Syria were still open, and wintered in Jerusalem." "Did he tell you much about Jerusalem?" "Yes. Many a winter night he would sit by the fire and talk about Jerusalem, for he arrived at a strange time some 26 years ago. The Romans had not long before crucified a man called Jesus, hated by the Jewish rulers, but greatly loved by the common people." "Why did the rulers hate him?" "They feared him, and he taught some new religion, but also they had crucified him. Jerusalem that winter was full of his followers. There were strange stories afloat, too. Hundreds had declared that he had risen from the dead and claimed that they had actually seen him. Besides, there was something about his followers that made people afraid of them. They possessed a strange power. Your father actually saw one of them take hold of a well-known lame beggar and commanded him in the name of Jesus to rise up and walk. And the man ran into the Jews' temple, leaping and shouting. They did not seem to mind being persecuted either." "But why were they persecuted? Did they do wrong?" "No. They were full of good works, but their teaching would have turned the world upside down. They taught a brotherhood between Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free. They made no difference. Naturally, the upper classes and the Jewish leaders opposed it. Did my father accept this teaching? No. He had his own gods and goddesses who lived on Parnassus, gods of thunder and gods of war and goddesses of hunting. His favorite, I believe, was the goddess of beauty, for he used to say he found her everywhere, in the sunsets, in the first spring flowers, in the vine tendrils. But he stayed for some months in Jerusalem, and just before he left he saw something he never forgot. One of the followers of Jesus, called Stephanus, was on trial for his life. He was brought into the council as the result of some street brawl, and your father was in the crowd. Stephanus was given a fair chance to defend himself, but he seemed not to care whether he lived or died, provided he could say what he believed about this Jesus. The mob got angry in the end, began shrieking and cursing, but he never even seemed to see them. He was looking up into the sky, his face alight like the face of a god. He said something, but your father could not hear. Later, one standing near avowed that he had cried out, "I see the heaven opened and Jesus standing at the right hand of God." Anyhow, the crowd all went mad and fell on him and dragged him outside the city and started to stone him. He looked up again and called to someone, but he was soon beaten down. Only just before he died, he seemed to be asking his God to forgive the murderers. To forgive the murderers? Onesimus suddenly laughed. "I don't believe it." Yet it was true. Having heard him, your father never forgot. Then that Stephanus was a poor fool. Tell me about the brigands. Your father lingered in Jerusalem and left the journey home too late. The first rains fell as he passed through the dark Sicilian gates. He was benighted with his companions, and the brigands came swooping down from the Taurus mountains. They took everything, his money, his clothes, and what he minded most, his precious books. He himself was taken captive and sold as a slave in the Phrygian market. "And then," said Onesimus softly, "he met you?" "My master paid a high price for him, because he was young and strong and handsome, and he married me, who had been born on the estate. I comforted him and bore him children, but life was hard on those high, desolate plains, and the first 3 died. Your father was never a good slave. Nothing could tame his fierce Greek pride." "And then I was born?" "Yes, you were born, and the end came quite soon. Our master was determined to break him, making him work for long hours in the deep Sicilian mud when he was weakened by coughing and fever. Then one day he ordered him to beat a child slave who had accidentally broken something, and your father refused. Our master struck him, and your father struck back. He never rose again from his bed after the punishment they gave him, although day after day in his fever he prayed the gods to give him strength to revenge his injuries. Then, on the night he died, it was very strange. He talked about Stephanus. 'How could a man die without fear and without hatred?' he asked me. 'How could a man ask forgiveness for his murderers? Whom did Stephanus see?' Many times he asked the question, but I could give him no answer. At dawn he died. And then? Soon after that, the gods executed vengeance, and our master fell from his horse while hunting and was killed by a wild boar. We were all sold again, and fate was kind. You and I were brought together, and, my son, you should praise the gods for a just master." "Why should I have a master at all?" said the boy obstinately. His mother laughed gently and ran her fingers through his thick, dark hair. "You were born like your father to love beauty and freedom, more's the pity. But tonight I will tell you something I have never told you before. Every coin I can earn or steal I am hiding away for you to buy your freedom. One day you will be free." He fingered the gold piece knotted in his girdle, and a wild hope surged up in his heart. One day he would be free. Free to wander, free to hate and to revenge himself. Free to love. He stared out into the night sky to where the first stars burned over Laodicea. That's the end of chapter 2. And I think we should stop right there. And I hope you're enjoying the story, Twice Freed, one of my favorites. So we were counting up the books that we have read in this group setting. And these are the books that we were able to come up with, and this makes, we'll count them together. So we have the Narnia stories, that's 7. And then we read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and the Neverending Story. I can't remember which order we read them in.
Neverending 20,000.
Okay, Kimmy says it was Neverending first and then 20,000 Leagues. And we read Mara. So that, okay, wait, I was at 9, and now I'm at 10, Mara. And then we read the Anne McCaffrey books, so that's 11, 12, 13. We didn't read them in order, but they're in order on YouTube, so if you watch it on YouTube, they are all in order. And we also read The Bronze Bow, and we read Ben-Hur. And is there anyone that I'm missing? That was 15. So that makes, this is the 16th book that we're reading. So I hope that you're enjoying Twice Freed. This is Daniel's first complete day back at our house, and we're excited to have him. And thank you all for watching us. I hope that you're enjoying the story, and we will be back tomorrow for chapter 3 and Psalm 24. So God bless you. Have a great night. And,
Go say goodnight, guys.
okay.
Night, guys.
Okay. Everybody says good night now. So here they come. They're just jumping for the camera.
I'll see you.
Jumping for the camera right now. Here's Daniel.
Hello.
Good night. Here's Kimmy.
Sorry, I'm not doing too well today. I have new teeth things in, and they hurt like crazy.
I'm tired.
So the story behind that is Kimberly has, they're not braces, they're, what are they called?
Clear
Aligners. They're called aligners. And so she is getting used to like every Thursday she's going to have to put a new set in. And it slowly is going to transform her mouth into a more Daniel says moneymaker, a more confident smile. So that's her goal here. Jessica says, hey Daniel, hey Kimmy. Jessica, I am so thankful that you stayed on to the end. I hope that you're really liking this book. I really like this book. So, and I think Ben liked this book. I don't know if he likes it now, but he liked it when we read it last time. So anyway, God bless you guys. Have a good night, and we will see you again tomorrow.